Hi, my name's Adam and welcome to my new Intro to Bubble course. In under 2 hours, I'm going to teach you how to use Bubble and how to build your own AI blog generation app from scratch. If you've never heard of Bubble or you're not a tech savvy person, the whole point of this course is to explain the basics of Bubble, take you through the framework, and add web app development to your list of skills. Good luck. I've just loaded into a new Bubble application for the first time, and as you can see, it's completely blank. What I'm going to do before I start building anything is take you through these separate tabs and explain what they actually do. So currently I'm on the design tab, and this is where everything UI happens. So whenever you create groups, buttons, headers, footers, anything design, that's what you do using all of these Bubble visual elements that you can see in the tree here. So this is a really powerful tab, and anything that you create in terms of lists or anything you want the user to interact with happens on this. Next up, we have the workflow tab. This is where we define all of our front-end workflows. For example, that could be when a button is pressed, run an action. So that could be send an email or show a pop-up, or even when the page is loaded, run another event. So this is where we kind of set up those actions to trigger when certain things happen on our front end usually. Next up, we have the data tab. So Bubble has its own built-in database, and this is where we can view everything data. So here we have our defined data types. Currently, because this is a new application, it's just user, but you could add separate data types in, for example, invoice or whatever else you require. And then you can define the fields in that data type. So I've added first name as a text here, but you could also add last name, profile image, etc. Next up, we have the data privacy within the data tab. And what you can define here is the rules around who can view and access what data. This is actually a really important tab. For example, if you had an application with sensitive data that you only wanted users that belong to certain companies or users with certain roles, such as administration roles, to view, this tab is where you go in and define all the rules around who can see what. Next up, we have app data. So this is where you actually view all of the records. As you can see here, I created a test record for a user. I defined the email as adam@testing.com and the first name is Adam. This is where you can also export this as a CSV, and there's a lot of things you can do, but to manually actually view the data, that's where you'd go. Option sets I'm not going to touch on too much, but essentially this is where you can define some static lists that don't change throughout your application. And file manager is where any file that is uploaded to Bubble is stored. So you can view, if you have a lot of images or PDFs, you can actually come to this file manager and view each file. Next up, we have the styles tab. So this is a really important tab. And what you can do here is define certain styles for a lot of the different Bubble elements. So in the left here, we can see buttons. You can also do checkboxes, groups, drop downs, etc. So for example, sometimes you might have, I call it the standard dropdown. You might also have a see-through dropdown and different styles for different parts of your application. And what that allows you to do is whenever you want to edit, a certain style, instead of editing every single individual UI element on your page, you can come to this styles tab and make the changes, and that will update across all of the styled instances of the standard dropdown throughout your app. We also have the styles variables tab. This is where you can define global fonts and colors. So colors that you're going to use throughout your application and also fonts, it's best to define those in here. That way you can refer to them. And if you ever need to change them, you can change them with the click of a button rather than going through what can be hundreds or thousands of UI elements. Next up, we have the plugins tab. So not only in here can you install plugins out of Bubble's very detailed and wide range of public plugins, you can also install the API connector, which allows you to integrate with any third-party API services within here. So this is a really powerful tool again. And most applications usually use one or two APIs. So we're going to talk about this in much more detail later on. Next up is settings. I'm not going to touch on this too much, but all the settings related to your Bubble application can be found in this tab. And then we have logs. So logs is where all the back-end workflows and back-end operations can be viewed within your application. So Bubble charges based on workload units, which is essentially server usage, and you can view that through this app metrics tab in your logs. What you can also do is view the individual logs for each workflow run in the server logs tab. As you can see here, you can control the times that you can view these certain things. And then we also have our scheduler tab, which is where you can view all of the upcoming workflows that are scheduled to run in your application. That's a brief overview on each of these tabs. And what we're going to do in the next few videos is touch on the specifics and really get into detail with how to begin creating an application within Bubble. Now that we've had our intro to Bubble and we understand what each of the tabs do, next up we're going to focus on the design interface to try and build a blog generation UI similar to the following screenshot. Now, what I'm going to talk about first is this elements tree and our base index page. So when you click on index, or you can edit properties, what will pop up is this here. The page title refers to what you see in the tab heading. So I'm going to call this page blog generation. And I'm not going to touch too many other settings here, but if you wanted to change the background color for the entire page, this is where you would do it. We also have various SEO tools available in here that we're not going to go into in too much details, and the HTML header for the page. But now what I'm going to do is talk about the layouts. Bubble has this responsive design editor, and it has 4 main layouts, which I'm going to explore quickly. What I'm going to do is drag a button onto the page to show how these actually work. What you currently see we have is the fixed layout. So what happens is I can drag this element anywhere and drop it. Now, I don't work with the fixed layout too much because it's difficult to create responsive elements using the fixed layout. The standard for the index page is the column layout. And you'll see what happens is this creates a column. So if I copy and paste, we then get 2 stacked in a column. What we can do is there's various controls. We can add a gap spacing. So let's say we add a 12. We can get things nicely spaced out. We can also change the alignment of these child elements within the column. So if you can see here, I can change that alignment. What else we have is we also have row. So you'll see when I click row, suddenly everything's aligned in a row. And again, we can add column spacing. So if I add 30, you're going to see we get that nice spacing between the elements. And finally, we have align to parent. Now, what align to parent does is it allows us to align the child element within the parent. So if I put that one in the center, and I can align this one around the element. Those are the basic 4 responsive settings you can use for each container. Now, what I'm going to do is put it back to column, because I like to start all my pages off with the column as the background layer. Now what we're going to touch on is the settings. So in here you can see we have preset width, default builder width. I tend to build in 1080 or 1200. The max width that I design most of my applications for is 1200, and if the monitor screen is larger than that, it stays within those 1200 pixel width. It really depends on what you want to design. You could have an application that stretches to the max width no matter how big the monitor. Certain people like to prefer to cap it off at 1200 pixels. It really depends on how you like to build. The other thing I'm going to quickly touch on is this visual elements. So you can see here we've got our main ones. We have text, button, icon, link, image, shape, etc. What you can actually do is if you install various plugins, it will add to these list of elements. So let's say I definitely know there's some chart plugins that will give you access to drag multiple charts onto this page. And there's really unlimited customization in terms of what you can get from plugins in this visual elements section. But these are all the Bubble native options. Now containers are what we actually store things within. So group is the standard. As you can see, I've just dragged a group in from the layer. And what I'll do is I'll change the background style so you can notice what it is. We have our background group. Now within that group, we can nest. I'm going to use a button again for an example. And we can actually change the container layout for that group. So whilst the parent might be a column, you could have an align to parent here, for example, and we can align that to the parent. Now, what we also have is repeating group. So any lists that you use within Bubble, what we do is we set up a repeating group, and we'll probably touch on that a bit more in future videos. But repeating groups are where you display lists within Bubble. A pop-up is fairly self-explanatory. Pop-ups, basically, if you want to show or hide a pop-up,
you can change and you can add things. So often you'll use these for deleting or displaying certain types of information, and you can show and hide them. Floating group is a little bit of a different one. So what you'll see when I run the page in preview mode is currently when we scroll, this group will stay fixed on the page. What a floating group will do is as you scroll up and down the page, that floating group will actually stay in the same spot. So most people use these for things like floating menus, where as you scroll down the index page, they still want that header to show at the top of the page. And then we have group focus. Group focus is really useful for things like toggling menus. So what happens is if you click a button, you can toggle and show the group focus. And whenever you click out of that, the group focus will disappear again. So it's mainly used for things like menus, drop-down menus and stuff like that. And we have the table feature, which is a beta version in Bubble at the moment, but it's essentially a repeating group. But basically it allows you to define the headers and rows a little bit easier. So it's really good for just creating quick tables. Much quicker to set up than the traditional repeating group. Now, finally, input forms. I'm not going to touch on these too much, but you have a whole range of different inputs that you can take from the user that you can drag and drop on your page. And the last thing I'll mention is reusable elements, which we already talked about before. If you define any reusable elements, those will show up in this section. Because we're familiar with what we have on the left-hand side of the screen and the tools that Bubble gives us, we're going to get started into building the basic UI for this blog element. What the first thing I do on any page is check to make sure our index page is a column and set these values to appropriate, depending on whether you're building a mobile application or a desktop application. You can play around with these settings. We're going to leave them at the defaults for now. We're going to bring our hero group onto the page. So every page has a basic hero group within the page, which is going to be your ultimate parent container. So I usually call it hero. There's a bunch of different naming conventions you can follow that are best practice. We're not going to focus too much on that in this video. Within the hero container, you can see we have our heading. So I'm going to create another group within that group. Now we want our hero container to stretch to the top of the page or to the entire page height. So we're going to unclick this fit height to content button. And you'll see what happens is it stretches all the way to the maximum height. Within that, we're going to have our group B. We can see it's around about 200 pixels high. So we're going to leave it at that for now. And what we're going to do is draw our text into the container. So we have our first text, which looks to be a large heading one, and we're going to call it new project blog post. Now, what we want to do is align this centrally, both vertically and horizontally. So all we're going to do is apply this fit width to content, and you can see the text snap to the width. And we're going to align it horizontally and also vertically. So it's now in the middle of our group, which is great. Now underneath that, we also want to have a subheading. So we can Command C, Command V. It's much smaller. So I'm going to take a look and see what that looks a little bit more appropriate. And we're going to add that in. Now we've got our heading. Next up, we want to add that actual content below our heading. We can see it's a slightly different color. So what we're going to do is drag in a new group. It's going to sit nicely below our heading, we can call it. And we're going to allow this to stretch to height. Now we can see it's not completely white. It's a little bit of I would say it's a light blue. So what we're going to do is come down to the blue here and maybe just give it a really light tinge of blue. Let's say something like that. So now that we've got that, we want to create our general structure here. So we can see there's a row, we've got our number, and then we have a column. It's important to break down the UI into rows and columns usually. Occasionally you've got a line to parent, but most things are in a row or column format. We have our group for the step one, and we can see when we look at it, it's almost a row with two columns. And then in that second column, it's a list of rows. And you'll see what I mean when I go to build this out. So the first thing we're going to do is that nice round step number one. And what that really is a colored group with some text in it. So what I'm going to do is get our group E, and we can see that it's a blue color. So I'm going to go down a flat color, and I'm going to make it nice and dark blue. With this blue, we can see it's a square shape. So what we're going to do is make it fixed width. And let's say it's 50 by 50 pixels. And it's obviously rounded. So let's put the roundness to 50, which should give us that nice circular shape. And we can see we've got our nice circular step 1. Now what we're going to do is drag our text within the group, and that's going to be a step 1, and we're going to make it fit to width and definitely remove the minimum width because we want it to be as skinny as possible. Now we're also going to align it centrally, and on the parent group, we're going to make sure everything in the container is also aligned horizontally or centrally in the vertical direction. We can see our number 1 here, which is obviously got to be a white text, but I think let's try heading number 3. Cool. So I think that looks about right to me. It's nice, it's centered, and we're going to run with that for now. So we can see we've got our step 1. Now what we want to do is actually have this as a row. Cool. We want to make our separate group. So let's label this one as group. You probably want to have some better naming conventions than what I'm using in this video, but just for our sake, that's what we'll do. And now I'm going to copy and paste the group. And this is going to be group step 1. I'm just going to call it group step 1 column for now. Now, this is also going to be a column, but what we're going to do is this is not going to be fixed width at all. And we can also remove that blue border. Now, we want it to contain the entire, to stretch to the container's height for now. So we're going to click that, and we're going to click this stretch to height. Okay, so now the first thing we can see is a text. So I'm also going to get rid of the roundness. And we're going to make sure everything hugs the top of the column. So this here, we're going to call describe the blog post you want to create. And let's say that's also, let's try heading 3. I think that looks about right. And underneath that, we can have some consistent spacing. So I think it looks like there's, let's try 12 pixels between each element for now. That looks a little bit excessive. We can see the number 1 there, that's why. All right, and let's put this to the text below it. I'm going to type the text out. You can see we've typed this out. I'm going to put it as heading 6 just to see how that looks. Let's check the body text, body large. All right, I'm going to leave that at body large for now. So we can see we've got that kind of shape going on, and underneath that we have what's called a multi-line input. So we have our regular input, which you'll see here is a skinny input field, and that doesn't allow you to add separate lines and click the enter tab. You can see here we've got a bigger input, so what we're going to use is this multi-line input. What I would recommend is obviously defining your styles, but what I'm going to do for the purpose of this video is just set it up without a style. So you can see it's got a bit of roundness, so let's come down to the roundness tab. 5 looks okay for now, and it's got a grey border, so I'm going to put the border at something like that, and you can see the background color is white. So it also stretches the entire width. So let's see what that looks like. All right, that looks pretty close. I'm going to make the border a little bit darker. And we'll probably want to add some thickness to that border. Let's add number 2. All right, we can start to see that gray border come through. I'm going to leave it like that for now. And what I'm also going to do is change the placeholder. So you can see here we have, so that's starting to look a bit better. Now, what you can also see up the top here is actually a counter for the amount of characters within the multi-line input. And so what we're going to do is set that up now. And then you can see it's actually in line with this text here. So what I'm going to do is arrange in a row container. And within our row, I'm going to set the max width of this as a percentage. So I don't want this to take up more than 70% of the width of the row to give it space for the characters. Now, I'm going to grab our second text. I'm going to put it in here. I'm just going to call this for now 0 out of 300 and fit to width. All right, so this is great. Now let's see if we can align it to the bottom and right. So to align it to the bottom of this container, we're going to click this. And to stretch each element in the row to the maximum space away from each other, we can either centrally, we're going to use this space between, and if you hover over, you can see what they are. Space around means it's almost the same as space between, but space between stretches to the maximum edge of the container, which is what we want. So you can see here, that stretches to the edge of the container. Now we want to get rid of that minimum width, and now we can see that it's on the edge there. But how do we get the amount of characters used in this multi-line input? So what we're going to do is have 300 as the maximum characters. And what we're going to do here is get our multi-line input. So we search for multi-line input, a blog post, which we can see that name corresponds with this name up here. And we get the value, and we can get the number of characters. So what we can see now is if we preview the page, now you can see we have our multi-line input, and you can see that the counter actually works based on what we type into our multi-line input. So we can see that character count working. Now, what we want to add under that again is our topic or industry. We can see there's a little bit more padding in there, but I'm just going to leave it as this for now. It's slightly smaller. So let's put heading number 4, maybe even heading number 5. Yep. And underneath that, we have a search box input. So we can use a drop down, but let's actually build this container out properly. So what I'm going to do is build this in an interesting way. So we have our group, and I'm going to set the background border of this group to the same as the multi-line input. So we're going to go background style flat color, border roundness, I think we had 5, and border color solid, and we're going to set it to this gray color with a width of 2. Awesome. Now within that, we can see a magnifying glass icon. Now I'm going to use the icon element here, but there's plenty of plugins that can give you some nice looking icons. Personally, I'm not a great fan of the bubble inbuilt one, so I'd recommend using feather icons, which is a common one, or whichever one suits your taste. So I'm going to add some padding on this container, the left and right, to pad this in nicely. And I'm going to change this to a search icon. Awesome. Now we're going to change that color to a gray, and we're going to get our drop down for our different industries. So let's find the drop down element here, and we're going to drag it in the container. Now, our first issue is this is a column and not a row. So let's make it a row. We want to align that centrally within the row. And we also want to add some gap spacing here so it doesn't look weird. So let's try 24 for now. Oh, that's a bit large. Let's try 16. And let's align that centrally. Now, we want this drop down to actually look like a part of the element. So what I'm going to do is effectively make it a see-through drop down. And what I mean by that is we remove the border, and you can see already, it almost looks like it's actually just a part of this parent element. I'm going to call it select your industry. And for now, I'm going to put some dummy choices in here, but later on, we're going to define some. So let's say technology, health, finance. All right. And we have a toggle beneath that. Now what we're going to do is install a toggle plugin because Bubble doesn't have a built one in here. So what I'm going to do is go to plugins, add. There's a lot of different options for toggles, but let's just search toggle, free toggle. We'll use this one for now. And you'll see what happens is it exposes an element, one element called toggle and one called toggle v2. So let's take a look at where we can find these. So if we scroll down to input elements, we can see toggle and toggle v2. So let's put toggle v2 in here and see what this looks like. Now we also want to arrange that in a row container, and we want to get some text in here. We want to align it centrally. We want to add some spacing, and we want to also align that centrally, and we're going to go SEO keywords, and then in a smaller text. So we're going to fit the width to content there. We're going to duplicate it, make it the body, and in here we're going to go optional. Now, to me, that looks okay for now. We can always touch it up a little bit later, and let's preview this and see what it looks like. Awesome. So what we can see already is that the minimum page height is not large enough. So let's edit the properties. And for now, let's set the minimum height to 1500. And you'll see, because I'm running this in the debugger, it sometimes cuts off a bit short, but you can see we've got our general set up here. Now you can see it still stretches the page width and looks a little bit funny. So what I'm going to do is set a maximum width on this group. And what I'm actually going to do is set a maximum width on the entire group to have 1200 pixels. And I want this to align centrally. So what we should see, and this is standard on some web pages, is everything is now within that 1200 pixel border. Because we want the colors to stretch the entire page width, I'm going to take a slightly different approach and set the background of the entire page to this light blue color. So we're going to come to the page, we're going to go background color, going to come to blue, and we're going to set it as a light blue like that. Now what I'm going to do is I want this to stretch to its complete page width, which it's currently doing. And this hero, we don't want that max width to be 1200. It's going to stretch the current page width, but what I'm actually going to do is also group this in a column container. And we're going to set the max width of what's inside of it to 1200 pixels. We're going to set the background of this to white. And you'll see what happens is the background will go the entire way, but because this max width is 1200 pixels and it's aligned centrally, and I'm going to quickly remove the background color on this as well, you'll see now that we have this come into that 1200 pixel range, which is great. What we also want to do is have this container at a maximum width of 1200 pixels. So I'm going to apply that now. The maximum width 1200, align it centrally. And what we get here is that nice color that stretches to the page width, but we also have everything within that 1200 pixel range. Now I want to add some spacing between these rows to make this look a lot nicer. So we're going to add a column gap of 20. At that point, things are looking a little bit better. I think we can probably say that that looks to be, we actually need to add some padding up the top there. So I'm going to add a little, we can do a margin or padding here, to be honest. I'm going to do some padding of 80. Or 80 looks a little bit extreme. Let's say 60. And there we have our step one with our blog created. So now that we have that sorted out, the next thing we're going to do is integrate OpenAI and set it up in Bubble's API connector so that when the users fill out the input fields we have here on the blog, we can generate some sample blog text using AI. So how do we go about doing this? If you've never used the API connector before, that's found in the plugins tab. And what you'll have to do is click add plugins and add Bubble's API connector. It's usually the top one that shows here because it's the most common. Once you've got that set up, I'm going to explain exactly how to set up authentication and the individual API call. And to do that, we have to look at the API documentation. So the common way of doing this is if you search up whatever platform you're using, in this case, we're using OpenAI, but if you were using something like Stripe or any other third-party service, you'd usually search up OpenAI documentation, and it should be the first or second link that pops up. When you jump in here, you can see there's two tabs. There's documentation and API reference. They're pretty similar things, but generally documentation is usually a more human explanation of what's happening. And the API reference is the actual endpoints. And you could call it code. It's the link to the endpoints to hit to actually generate the data. For us, we're going to be using the simple chat functionality. And if we look down at the endpoints, we can see that chat is one of the endpoints. So when we open this tab, we can see a bunch of information here. So what we can see is create chat completion, which is what we're looking to do. We can see the endpoint, and we can see that it's a post call, which means we're posting data. On the right-hand side here, we can see some code, and you can see here it says curl. In Bubble, curl is the preferred way. You can actually import curl directly into the API connector, which is what we're going to do. So it makes it super easy. But if it's in another language, we can definitely still integrate that. You just need to take a look at the key information. So the key information when you're setting up a plugin is the headers, and we'll see that in our application here. You can see headers, shared headers, parameters. So our parameters are usually with the D. In this case, it's a JSON body, and the link. So we're going to post to this endpoint. Now, what you can see here is I've set up two separate calls. So in our header, you can see it has shared headed for all calls. And you can see down in the actual call, we can still add headers here. What shared does is if you have particular API keys that might be used in every single call that you create, you can add a shared header, which saves you having to add the header every single time you create a new API call. Now, I also have OpenAI organization. That's because I work with multiple different companies and they have different organization keys. We're not going to talk about that one in too much detail, but the authorization is the main one. You can see we have bearer and token. Now, you want to be careful. This token is secure information, and if someone was to get this token, they could make calls to OpenAI on your behalf, and technically you would be paying for it. So what you want to do is make sure that that token is in the header and that it's either in the shared header or it's in the individual call header and that private button is checked. What the private checkbox means is that that's hidden from the console when you make API calls, and that means that people can't view it and steal your API key. Now, what I'm going to do is delete this for now, and we're going to go through and set this up naturally. So I've already inputted my API key in here. I'm going to hide it from you because it's secure information. I'm going to delete it after this video anyway. And what we're going to click is this import another call from curl. So this makes it super easy. We can come back to OpenAI. We can click this code copied and we can paste it right into here. Now you'll see it imports in here. We're going to give the name a bit more of a descriptive label. And this is the name that we'll be using when we actually use the call in Bubble. So I'm going to call it chat endpoint. And it's a post call to the chat completions endpoint. What you'll see here is use as data or action. So what this means is when we use an API call in a workflow here, it's an action. And when you refer to an API call using the dynamic expression, so you can put it in here, get data from an external API, that's a data call. So they're two separate things and you can't use it for both. In the case that you wanted to use it for both, the way I usually label it is I'll call it action, and then I'll simply duplicate the call and call another one data. But in this case, we're not going to use it for that at the moment, and I'm not going to do that. But what we'll do here, you can see it has bearer open API key here. We can delete that because we have it in the shared header. And it has a JSON body. So in this body, you can see it has the model, which is we're going to use GPT 3.5 Turbo. You could make that model dynamic and you can see the messages. Now, we want the user to be able to customize this message. So what we're going to do is add a dynamic input here, and we're going to say user message. Now, what the user can do is we can change this on our front end and use a dynamic message, which is what's going to happen. We're going to use hello for now. And what I always do is check this box. What this box does is it returns any errors, if any exist, to the workflow. And the reason I use this is because in the applications that I set up, I usually set up some sort of API request logging to store the errors, because you never know. OpenAI could be down. You might have set up something incorrectly. The user might put in an input that has a syntax error or something like that. And if you want to catch those errors and fix them, you need to store them somewhere. So I always tick this box whenever I'm setting up an API call, and I hit initialize. Now, this is what comes back to Bubble. I'm going to touch on this super quickly, but Bubble automatically categorizes the response in a certain field. Occasionally, you'll get a date or some sort of object back and Bubble won't categorize it correctly. So if you ever want to come in and change that, this is the place to do it. And you can also view the raw data or the raw JSON returned if you're interested. Now, if that looks all good, you can hit save, and that will save in your API connector and be set up. So the next thing we're going to do is actually integrate this into our application. Okay, so now that we have OpenAI set up in our API connector, the next thing we're going to do is set up a button on our front-end UI to trigger that endpoint or send the blog description, the industry of the company to that endpoint and get a sample blog back generated with AI. So there's a couple steps we're going to do here. And the first one is to put the button on the page and set up the workflow. So we have our column here. What I'm going to do is just drag a button into the column. So you can see that there. I'm going to make it last and right align it. I'm going to call the button generate. For the purpose to just display the result, what I'm going to do now is add a temporary group below called group OpenAI result test. I'm going to define it as text because that's what the returned information is going to be. And I'm going to put a text field in here just to log the results. And I'm going to set the data type to the parent group's text. So what we're going to do is with the generate here, we are going to set up the workflow. So it's called OpenAI chat endpoint. And you're going to make sure that this is an action for it to show up in the actions workflow here. And we're going to set the message to please generate a blog post. We're going to set this to the value of the multi-line input. And then after that, we're going to say as well, the company is in the, whatever the drop-down industry is, drop-down industry value. So that is what we're going to send to the OpenAI endpoint. And with the response, we're going to display it in the group. So the group was called OpenAI result. So we're going to display in group OpenAI result test. And it's going to be the result of step 1. As you can see, there's a lot of different objects here. So we have all of our error endpoints. And if we were logging certain things to debug it, we would definitely use these fields. And you can see all these body fields here. So what do these actually mean? If we go back to the plugin and we click manually enter API response, we can see the breakdown here. So what we're looking for is under the body, we're looking for under choices. So body, choices, content is what we're looking for. And it's going to be the first item because we're just sending one message. So if I come back here, we can go body, object. So body, choices, and then content. Each message is content, first item. We need to run this to actually see the result. So if I click preview, we have our page here. And what I'm going to do is press generate in the debugger and see what happens. Keep in mind, it's going to take 4, maybe 5 seconds for the result to come back. So we have our action here. As you can see, I can't run next until it's completed. And you can see the data to display. So this is our result, which is awesome. So here is our sample blog. Now, what we're going to talk about next is how we can kind of use some UI loading elements and things like that to smoothen this out and make it seem seamless to the user that's actually using this. So now that we have OpenAI set up and working, the next thing we're going to do is set up the step 2 in the UI and get this next button working. So as you can see in the proposed UI, this button actually says next, and it's grayed out if the input or the drop down are empty. So how we're going to set this up is in the conditionals, we can set up the button to act in a certain way based on certain conditions. So in this case, when the multi-line inputs value is empty, or the drop downs value is empty, we're going to make this element not clickable. And we're also going to give it a background color of gray. We're also going to add a little bit of roundness to this because you can see that in the design. And let's see what it looks like. Cool. So as you can see, it's looking like it does in the UI design. Now what we're going to do is add that line and add the step 2, which is title. So what I'm going to do is actually add some padding on the bottom of this group, similar to the top. And I'm going to give it a border just on the bottom. In the appearance, down at the border, we can define each border independently. And at the bottom, we're going to use a solid line. Let's make it gray like that. And let's see what happens. So we can see we have this nice gray line here that separates the steps. So now to create step 2, what I'm going to do is delete the generation since we know that's working. And I'm going to copy step 1. And paste it in group C. So we now have step 2 down here. Going to redefine this as step 2. And what I'm going to do is set up the custom states to hide step 2 when this step 1 hasn't been viewed and show it when the next button is pressed. Now there's 2 ways to do this. 1 is to use custom states and 2 is to use URL parameters. I'm going to quickly explain the difference between the 2. Custom states are basically custom values stored on an element that refresh every time the page is refreshed. So that they only exist for as long as the browser session is active on this page. URL parameters are a little bit different. Those are parameters that are stored in the URL. So when you direct a user to a page and refresh the page, whatever's stored in that URL stays there. So in this scenario, if they were on step 2 and we stored the step parameter in the URL and they refreshed the page, they would load back to step 2. If we used a custom state and refreshed the page, they would be redirected back to step 1. Now in this case, because we're not saving the multi-line input and drop-down values to the database and we can't preload them to step 2 if they refresh the page, I'm going to be using custom states. Now how do we set that up? Best practice is to always set up custom states to the uppermost parent container in your group, unless there's a few niche scenarios where you wouldn't do this, but best practice usually is to attach a custom state to the parent element, which in this case is hero. And the reason for that is occasionally on certain elements, especially in repeating groups, they cannot be referred to by elements outside of that repeating group in certain scenarios. But if the custom state is attached to the hero, they can be. So what I'm going to do is add a parameter called step, give it a number, and by default, when this page is loaded, we want them to load to step 1. So I'm going to set the default value as 1. Now, within this group, when the step isn't 1, the only thing we want to display is this top text. So what I'm actually going to do is define this in a column. Click another column. I'm going to call this group step 1. And what I'm going to do is actually just drag this outside the group there. Still looks good. And what I'm going to do is modify this group step 1 here to be hidden when the step is not 1. So again, on this conditional, I'm going to go when hero step is 1, this element is visible. When hero step is not 1, we want it collapsed, and we'll animate it to a slide up and down. Similarly, we want to do the same thing here. So I'm going to arrange this into another column. I'm going to call it group step 2. And what I'm going to do is pull this outside the group. I'm going to set this as group step 2 column. And I'm going to edit the properties of this to be hidden when hero is not step 2. So hero step is 2. This element's going to be visible. And we'll hide it when it's not step 2. So let's see what this looks like. Cool. So we've got this step 2 here, and it is not visible. Now, what I am going to do is now set up this next button. So currently it does that OpenAI chat endpoint. I don't want to be using that at the moment, so I'm going to disable the workflow, save this here, and what I'm going to do is set up the button next, and what it's going to do is set the state of hero to step 2. And we should get that nice step 1, step 2 feel. So let's test this out. Select a drop down. As you can see, our next button now becomes available. And when I hit next, you can see step 1 hides and step 2 becomes visible. So now that we have this step 1, step 2, there's a few things we can touch up in the UI, and then let's get step 2 looking. So it's actually supposed to be the title field. So let's modify that UI to reflect accordingly. So what I have noticed is that we have this gap underneath step 1, which is not ideal. And why is it there? So how to identify that there is something there is if you use this inspect tool, you can see this separate step 1 field when we click. So we know it is a bubble element that's taken up that space. And what I did is I came in here, I saw step 1, and you can toggle and hide this, and you can see that this field is actually still there when the step 1 is hidden. So if we edit the properties, we see it's because of this minimum height being 60. So what I'm going to do is remove the minimum height and refresh the page. It's actually going to load step 1 by default there. But let's do the same for step 2. So here, edit profile. The minimum height should be 60. So let's see what happens when we load this now. So we can see it's still there. What we can do is actually we're going to modify the container settings. And we can see here again. So we have another minimum height on that element. So as you can see, now that's shrinking to size. So what I'm going to do is remove that minimum height, and we can go ahead and keep that element stretching to height. So now if we refresh the page, it's going to look a lot more natural as step 2. That is awesome. Now we're going to redefine step 2 to title. And let's show this element again. So we want them to generate a title. So I'm going to remove the multi-line input. We're going to remove that field as well. We're also going to remove the SEO keywords. We can leave group K there for now, but what I'm actually going to do is delete it and get our input field. So we're going to put our input for the title in. What I'll do is set the background to the same color we were using before. We want it to stretch to the full page width, and we want to give it a slight border. So I'm going to give it a slight gray, and roundness of 5 looks okay. Now I also want to just grab some label text. We haven't been too strict on the labeling in this video. That's something we'll touch on in another course, because that's an entire concept in itself. And I've just tried to create this quickly and easily so you can follow on using descriptive labels. There's a bunch of different naming conventions that you can use though. But then if we load this page now, we can now see that this is looking a lot cleaner. I'm going to test this again. And when we click next, we can see we get that nice feel of adding a title. And our next step is going to be step 3, which is blog generation. So we'll explore how we can set up a nice looking blog using the response from OpenAI, and also how we can use a loading spinner and some UX design to really seamlessly make that 5 seconds or so that OpenAI takes to generate the information, try and make it feel as painless to the user as possible. So now we have step 2 sorted out. What I'm going to quickly take a look at is the errors. So we're going to quickly fix, this one's going to be for input blog title. We're not going to allow that to be clickable when input blog title is empty. And that solves our errors. And now I'm going to set up step 3, which is basically where we're going to view the generated blog. And we're going to have some fields to allow us to further edit this blog if we want to touch up what's been returned by OpenAI. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste step 2. We're going to call this step 3, and we're going to call this section, it's called outline and then design, but I'm going to call it blog post or just blog. Now, for this stage, what I'm going to do is delete these, and I'm going to set this as the actual return state from the hero. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up these states to capture the information as we go through. So in the hero custom state, currently we store the step. What I'm also going to store is the OpenAI blog description, which is a text. I'm going to store the OpenAI industry, which is also a text. And I'm going to store the title, which is also a text. Now, the last thing I'm going to store is the OpenAI response, which is what I'm going to display in step 3, which is a text. So in step 3 blog, I'm going to, at this stage, set this as the response. So it's going to be heroes OpenAI response. And now we're going to set up the custom states to update based on the next buttons. So there's a few ways to edit the expression on the next button. I tend to click the information button and then click the link to the event. And what I'm going to do is also set the states here. So blog description is going to be multi-line input blog posts value, and industry is going to be drop down industry's value. Now, we're going to, instead of this, I'm going to call this button next S1. I'm going to call this button next S2. We're going to generate the OpenAI response actually on button next S2. So I'm going to change this, and I'm going to send the endpoint, send the OpenAI chat endpoint on the button S2 press. I'm also going to set the state of an element hero. This step's going to be step 3, and the OpenAI title is going to be input blog titles value, and then we're going to call this chat endpoint, so we can actually use the hero custom states here instead of the drop down values. Industry and title. Awesome. So this is our prompt. It's worth noting that OpenAI can have some inconsistencies in the responses based on certain prompts. So it's definitely worth doing your own testing, and it's called prompt engineering, but making modifications to this prompt to get the consistent output that you're looking for. Now, once that's done, we're going to finally set the state of Hero's OpenAI response to the result of step 2. So it's choices, content. Awesome. So that should be, we're going to undisable that workflow. And we also need to make sure that we have the settings for our copied group set up. Now, best practice would be to go through and change all these names. I'm going to leave them how they are for now, but what should happen is when we run this, we should be able to get a response in our step 3. So let's see what happens. Now, we haven't actually set up this SEO keywords toggle. And what we can do is let's set that up. So in the hero, we can have a custom state. This one's going to be called SEO keywords, and it's going to be called yes, no. So it's a bit different. This is also, it's similar to a true false field, or it is a true false field. And we can have the default value set to no. Or actually, we're not going to set a default value, but when they click next, we can set the state of SEO keywords to be equal to the toggle v2 checked. So if it's checked, it's going to be yes. And if it's not checked, it's going to be no. Now, in our prompt, we can edit this. And what we could actually do is we can just put a dot here. Now, if SEO keywords is untoggled or unchecked, we don't really want to add anything to this post. But if it is checked, we want to add a sentence saying, please use well-known keywords to boost this blog's SEO. And the way we can do that is use what's called the formatted as text function in Bubble, which is extremely powerful. So what I'm going to do is get the OpenAI SEO keywords. And what I'm going to do is go formatted as text. Now, this is very similar, and you can think of it as an if condition. So what happens is if the SEO keywords is checked, so is yes, we display this text, which currently just says yes. And if it's no, we display this text. Now, it's extremely powerful, this tool. You can use it in a lot of different use cases. But in this scenario, when it's not checked, we don't want to display anything. And when it is checked, we're going to display the text. So that's how we use the formatted as text operator. Now what we're going to do is give this a test run. Let's call it all right, I'm actually going to do what in health. All right, and we're going to select SEO keywords, and we're going to say next. The title should be Awesome. So that's the title. And then let's see what happens when we click next. So we have this loading. You can see up the top that OpenAI is generating the response. It can take a few seconds. And we have our result. Now, as you can see, the formatting is a little bit weird, but at least we have this 3-step process working. So next up, we're going to touch on how we can make this look a whole lot nicer for our users. So now we have the basic flow of this working. The next thing we're going to do is show a loading pop-up when they click the generate button on the page here. So how do we go about doing that? The first thing we're going to do is come down to our elements tree, and we're going to select pop-up, which is under the containers section. We're going to drag that onto our page. So at the moment, it's called pop-up A. We're going to set it to a container, and you can see it's at the top of our page. And what I'm going to do is use this as a loading pop-up. So what I'm actually going to do is call it pop-up loading. In some applications, you might want to make this pop-up loading a reusable element. And so I'm going to set it up as if it was a reusable element. In this case, because it's a basic scenario, I'm just going to have it as one pop-up, but I'm going to set it up in a way that if you had a reusable element, it would be the exact same process. So what I'm going to do is have a heading, define that as a text. I'm going to have a message. We're going to define that as a text, and that's it. Now I'm going to drag 2 texts onto the pop-up. So we have text 1. We can see this is a column. Because we want it to look nice, I'm going to add some square padding around the entire pop-up. And I'm going to set this to be, let's say, heading 3. And we're going to call it. So we're going to have this as the pop-up loading heading. And I'm going to call it loading because that's what we're going to use for now. I'm going to center the text, and then I'm going to have a separate text underneath it, which is going to be a lot smaller. Let's put it as body text. And this is going to be message. Now, what I'm going to have this show is cool. And we have a simple loading pop-up. I'm going to align the text centrally on that as well. Now, the last thing I want to do is have a nice loading spinner. Now, you have a lot of different options for a loading spinner. You can add various plugins, and what I'm going to do is actually add the Lottie Files plugin. Now, what is Lottie Files? I'm going to go to Lottie Files now and show you what you can do in here. So there's a lot of different animations, and they look really cool. They can sit really nicely in a UI, and you can customize the colors and everything to make it work with your design. Now, I've already used this a bunch of times, so I'm going to use a pre-existing Lottie file that I already have. And I'm going to use that element on our page. So if we scroll down in the elements tree, and we can find the Lottie Files element, and we're going to put that into our container. Now, I'm going to use this animation here. And what you can do is when you come into Lottie Files, you can click the share button, go to handoff and embed, and you can actually grab this asset link here. And in the application, if you throw that link into the dynamic link section, take off the controls, and play it on page load, you can see here we get our nice animation. So that's our pop-up designed in a basic way. Now we need that pop-up to display when the user clicks the next button and to hide once the OpenAI piece or response is generated. So we're going to open our button next, S2, and we're going to show an element. Let's call it pop-up loading. And then what we want to do is set the state of the element. Pop-up loading. And this is where we set the heading and the message. So the heading is going to be loading. I'm actually going to leave the dots out of that one. And the message is going to be cool. So if you had a reusable element and you had loading across various parts of your application, you could have one pop-up that's called pop-up loading, and you just constantly change the heading and the message that's actually shown. This also applies to things like deletion pop-ups, and it really saves you having 20 or 30 different pop-ups in your application. So now we've got that, we'll then hide it at the end of the workflow. So we're going to hide pop-up loading. And what we should see now is a nice pop-up show when they do the generation. So we're going to run another quick test. Let's toggle that on. Going to click next. Very random blog. And then we're going to click next. And as you can see, we get this nice loading pop-up whilst OpenAI is generating. Awesome. And that has generated. So as you can see, it's a way to communicate to the user what's actually happening rather than leaving them in the dark when you're running workflows on your application that can take a few seconds. So now that you can see our blog is completely functional, let's see if we can't allow the user to make additions or edits to the generated output from OpenAI and also add things like images and rich text functionality. So let's explore how we can do that. What we have is currently this text box this one here, which is just the text. And what we're going to do is use a rich text editor, which is a plugin in Bubble to allow the user to edit the generated output. So we're going to come to the plugins tab here and we're going to search for rich text editor. Now, as you can see, there's a variety of different options you can choose from. Some are free and some are paid. We're going to use this free one by Bubble. It's good. I've used it before. If you're looking for functionality that might not be included in the Bubble native one, feel free to check out the other ones and you might find that those ones work better for your use case. But for this app, we're going to use this rich text editor. Now, when you come to the visual elements section, you'll see that rich text editor, sorry, not visual elements in input forms, you'll see rich text input is now available. So what I'm going to do is drag that into the group. Cool. So we can see it's dropped in there. What I'm going to do is allow it to stretch to the full width. And then we're going to make the initial content of the input equal to the OpenAI response. So what should happen is when this is visible on the page and the OpenAI response is not empty, it will automatically load into this rich text input. And so we can delete this old text field. When we rerun the test, we should be able to edit the text within this rich text editor. So let's give that a go. Cool. So when we hit next, we're going to get our loading screen again with the nice looking animation. And now we have our input automatically load into the rich text editor. So let's have a look at what kind of things we can do in here. So let's say we wanted to bold that text. That looks good. And let's make it a little bit bigger. Now we can also do things like potentially attach an image, include a link, or we could even put some dot points on the text here. So we can now add that kind of functionality. And as you can see, I think this is pretty user-friendly and nice to look at, but there's a bunch of different options you could use if you wanted to embed a different modern rich text editor into your application. Now that we have this, we've got our fully built blog within the application where you can go through the 3 steps of describing your blog, setting a title, and sending that information to OpenAI and getting a response. And then we're allowed to format the blog in here and set up whatever you want to do after this blog is generated. So certain things you could do when you hit next are you could create a record in the database for the blog and display that on a website. You could send this text to some sort of third party to use, or you could even send it in an email. So the options are really limitless, and we'll explore some of those in a future video. So now we have our blog page working. The next thing we're going to do is clean up some of these small errors that's in the top right here. And then we're going to investigate the responsive editor and how we can make this page look editable and usable on all screen sizes. So the first thing we're going to do is quickly clean up these errors. These are something I probably should have done before. So we want to, when we're looking at these, so A cool thing to do is to reveal in the elements tree so we can actually figure out where these buttons are and we can toggle them on and off. So we can see button next here. We want it to be unclickable when the rich text editor or rich text input value is empty. Awesome. Now Lottie files as well. This is something that happens whenever you set it up. Has a bit of a bug where it wants you to set a background color. We don't want a background color, so I just always set it at 0 opacity and set the background to any color you like. So this is now working and we'll preview the application again. And it looks great and usable on web, but let's explore this responsive editor and what this thing might look like on a mobile device. So when we toggle into this responsive page, this page is all about designing your bubble application or web page to view it in different sizes. Now, what you can see here are called breakpoints. So we have 1200 pixels, which is what we've labeled as the desktop breakpoint. We have 992 for tablet, 768 for mobile landscape, and 320 for regular mobile devices. Now you can edit these. These are just guidelines. They're not fixed. This is an industry standard based on some UI kits to use these sizes, but there are some niche cases where you may want to edit these yourself or add your own breakpoints, and you can do that by clicking this plus button and adding a custom breakpoint. Now you can see here what I've done is select 320, and so we get a bit of an idea of what this looks like on a mobile device. Now what we can actually do as well is view this in the preview mode using Chrome's developer tools. Now I'm not going to talk about Chrome's dev tools too much, but it's an extremely powerful tool, and it's definitely worth taking your own time to watch a course and understanding what certain things, especially in this top row, do in Chrome's dev tools. But what I'm going to do is show you how to view this in different screen sizes. So what we're going to do is click this toggle device toolbar, and what you'll see is we now get into the mobile mode. So if you untoggle this, you're in desktop mode, and if you toggle this, you're in mobile mode. Up the top here, you can see the dimensions that we're viewing this page at. And you can actually refresh the page and still view it in the editor. So you can see here, it looks pretty ugly. Let's put it at 320, which is what we're going to define as the base size, and refresh the page. We can see here, it doesn't look too nice at 320 pixels. So let's come back into the editor at 320 and make some changes. What I want to do is add some basic padding at 320. So I'm going to set this at 320. And we can see that there's some issues with this not spreading to its complete width. So the first thing we're going to do is add a condition, and you can actually search for each breakpoint. So I'm going to call this mobile, and you'll see we get our mobile breakpoint actually show up in the editor. This is a new feature. So I'm going to say when current page width is greater than equal to mobile, and for now, we're just going to do greater than equal to. We want to add some padding on the left and right. So on the left, because it's a small screen size, we want to be kind of careful. I'm going to use 8, and on the right, I'm also going to use 8. And you can see we get a slight padding in from the sidelines, which is what we're looking for. Now we can also modify this text font size. So what I'm going to do is copy, to make it quick and easy, I'm going to copy that expression. Now what you actually can do is add these these styles on the heading itself, and this makes a lot more sense. So what we're going to do is come into the style heading, go to the conditional tab, and do the exact same thing. And we're going to say when current page width is greater than equal to mobile, we want the font size to be a lot smaller. So let's try 36 pixels and see what it looks like. We'll go to the style. Let's refresh this page. All right, so that looks a little bit nicer. We also want to align it centrally, so we can look at the text alignment and put that in the middle. Cool. To me, that looks a little bit better. And we also want to edit this. So I'm going to copy that condition, come to this text here. We're going to edit the style of heading 5, come to the conditional. We're going to paste that condition, and I'm going to make this font size 18 and see what that looks like. Okay, so I think that looks a little bit better for the mobile screen size. And what we're going to do next is try and see if we can get this container here to spread out. Now we can see here that this drop down is it's stretching off the page, and so that means its minimum width is too large. So let's take a look and see what's happening there. So in groups, S1. Let's look at what we have in here. So let's inspect the elements. So in the layout settings, we can see here the min width is 280. Let's reduce that to 200 for now. And let's also see this is 200. All right, and let's refresh the page and see if that fixes our stretch bug. Okay, so as you can see, that's now stretching to the edge of the page, which is much better. So we reduce that, and now you see everything stretching to the edge of the page. What I think we should probably do here is let's see if we can change this to a column instead of a row and have the one show up above the describe the post you want to create. So what we're going to do is this is a row. What we're going to do is say when current page width greater than or equal to mobile, and I'm going to say less than mobile landscape. We're going to have the container layout. How we're going to do this is we're actually going to put this group, this in another group. I'm going to call it a column container. And we're going to have that fit width to content. But when it's in this, when it's a mobile view, we're going to have the minimum width stretch to 100%. And we're going to have the alignment we actually want, for this same setting, we want group step 1 circle to be in the middle. So what should happen is when we refresh the page, the 1 will now push into the middle, and it should give a sort of exactly like that. So we get this top kind of icon here, followed by this text below it. It's better real estate for the mobile screen space than having rows. Now what I want to do is add some padding between the 1 and this describe. So I'm going to do that quickly. I'm going to add the bottom margin, and I'm going to put that as, what's the padding here? I think it's 60. Yeah, so I'm going to put that bottom margin as 60. And let's see what we get. Awesome. So we get this step 1, and we start to get this look a little bit nicer on mobile. Now, what I'm also going to do is edit these styles. For the mobile view, just going to touch these up to only show in mobile. And now what I'm going to do is change the alignment for these text groups as well. So what we're going to do is apply the same condition. I'm going to change the minimum width to 100%. Going to change the text alignment to be central. And I want to have some padding on this as well. Sorry, margin, I'm going to put that as 12. And I'm going to copy that condition and add it to the input here as well. Now let's see what that looks. It should be a lot more center aligned. Okay, that looks good. We also need to do the same thing for this. Text alignment, central, bottom margin. Let's put that at 12. I'm actually going to change that to 8. And let's see what we get. Awesome. So this is looking a little bit better. Our new problem is it's still stretching outside the screen a little bit. So let's put this at 320 and refresh the page. And you can see here, we still have this scroll. So something's minimum width is too large. And really for all these, we actually want to remove the minimum widths because we don't really, none of these containers, they can all stretch to width. So that's okay for now. So I think it may potentially be to do with some of these. Let's refresh the page and see if that helps. So we still have something stretching. Let's check the group home hero. Let's remove that. Let's try this again. Try this one more time. And you can see we still have a little bit of scroll. All right, so that looks good. And we really should be able to edit this. So let me refresh the page here. And that looks like it's all nicely fitting in our 320 pixels. So if we scroll down, we now have a much more mobile friendly view of what this blog page is going to look like. So I'm going to edit the title page quickly just to make sure that that looks the same. So what I'll do is come to the title page, show the group step 2 column, going to hide group step 1, and I'm going to open our responsive editor again, come to group step 1 column or step 2, and you can see here, this one as well, we need to apply the exact same thing. Now, what you should be doing is applying certain styles, but I'm doing this on each one individually just to kind of show you guys how this works. Best practice, because I'm building as I go, best practice would be to recognize we're doing this on 3 separate steps and actually use a style to... So what I can do quickly is grab this, copy, paste, copy and paste, grab the parent container, copy, arrange that in a column, fit the column to width, and paste. Now what we should be doing with this column, it's got a min height of 60. We should be getting rid of that. And let's refresh this page. And the other thing's going to be editing these styles. Now they should all be shrunk. The title we haven't changed, but we will have to edit the alignment for each of these groups. So in here, cool, let's take a look. So let's run a little test. So post and stored in step, build a YouTube channel. Topic's going to be finance. Let's click next. Now our title is going to be how to build a YouTube channel. Next. So we can see here that loading pop-up needs to be a bit smaller. We'll edit that after this. And we also need to reduce the size of a rich text editor. So I'm going to do that now. Pop-up loading. 240, maxed width 320. And rich text editor. Min width on this is going to be 200. And we're going to fit the height to content. So this should now work. We can also see step 3 is not centering properly. So full alignment. All right, let's refresh this page. Awesome. So that's looking a lot better. The last thing is this background color. Let's take a look at what we assign that to. So we'll see here that the minimum height is 1500. What we really need to do is, let's actually assign this color on. I'm going to grab that color, going to select that to none, and it should be on group hero, which we can get to fit height to content. So we want to click that and we want to apply a background color, and we're going to replace that color there. Now let's refresh this page. So we have group J that fits height to content, fit height to content on group C, and this should now work. So the fit height to content and those settings can be very fidgety. And what I'd recommend doing is you do have to kind of test these and do a lot of playing around to get this to work, which is what the entire responsive editor is for. So now we refresh the page, we should have this working. Cool, that looks a lot smoother. So I'm going to test this again. I'm going to go how to start a YouTube channel, topic or industry, finance. Next, how to start a YouTube channel. Our pop-up now fits to size, which is great. Takes some time to load. And we have our blog, which is now fitting in perfectly. So that's our overall method of readapting this site to fit to a mobile page as well as the desktop page. Now, best practice would be to go through the developer settings and really check what this looks like on every page size. The minimum I usually do is 320 pixels, no smaller than that. But best practice is definitely to go over this and test it on all different screen sizes, add the relevant conditions, set it up in your styles properly, which we haven't done too well in this video, just for showing you the basic controls. Currently, you have to be in the bubble editor to load into this page. And when we click next, at this stage, nothing is happening. So what we're going to do is when they click next, we're actually going to create the blog as a record in the database, and then give you the option to preview the blog on a page. So we're going to create a unique URL where each of your blogs can sit. So how do we get this set up? So first off, we have to create a database field called blogs, or we're going to call it blogs. So the data type is going to be called blogs. And what kind of fields are we going to store in here? So we're going to have our actual blog content, which is going to be a large text field. It's actually going to be stored as BB code, and we'll talk about that when we do it. But we're going to have our blog content. We're going to have our title. And for now, we'll just start with those two fields. So when we click next, we're going to set a condition on here to create a new record. And we're going to create a new blog. Now, our title, our blog content is going to equal the output of the rich text input, which is the rich text input's value. And the title is going to equal, we've actually stored it with our hero container as a custom state. It's going to be called OpenAI title. So we'll set it as title being Heroes OpenAI title. And what we're going to do then is show a pop-up to allow the user to preview the blog. So we haven't actually created the pop-up yet, but let's reuse this pop-up here. We're going to copy it, and I'm going to paste it on the page, and I'm going to call this pop-up preview blog. Instead of having an icon, what we're going to have is two buttons. One of them is going to say yes, and the other one's going to say no or create a new blog. So we're going to push this. We're going to arrange it in a row because we're going to have two buttons. So we'll have a second button in here. And what I'm going to do is remove the fixed width. I'm going to fix the width to content. We're going to add a bit of a gap between the two. So let's say 20 pixels. They're going to be some fairly small buttons. This one's going to be yes. And this one here is going to be no. All right. Now, for our yes button, we want to make this a nice pressable button. Let's say blue. And for our no, we want to make it a gray color because we want to encourage them to preview the blog. Now we're going to get rid of the minimum height on here, and we want this to go to the bottom of the blog. So you can see here with our column, everything is hugging the top. What we want to do is we want to have these two texts at the top. So I'm going to arrange these in a column container, and we want to have the buttons at the bottom. So there's two different alignments we can use. We can use the space between, so that's going to stretch them to the absolute max, or we can use the space around, which I think looks a little bit cleaner. So actually, I changed my mind. We're going to do the space between. Now, when they click yes, what we want to do is send them to the page where they can preview the blog, and we're going to build that out in a second. But for now, we'll do when they click no, we're going to hide an element. So we're going to hide the element, which is pop-up preview blog. All right. Now, when they click next, we want to show this pop-up. So we're going to come into here. Once they create the blog, we're going to show an element. And we're going to do pop-up preview blog. Now, what we also want to do is display the created blog in the pop-up. And so what I mean by that is when any group or pop-up, you'll see it has this type of content. And if we display the blog in here, we can then use that same blog data type in the buttons and all the child elements in this pop-up. So you'll see when I go to the workflow and I look for the display data in group or pop-up, I'm going to display result of step 1, which is this new created blog in our pop-up. And you'll see what it prompts me to do is actually to change the type of the pop-up to type blogs, which is our data type. So I'm going to select that. And when you come back to the pop-up, you'll see it's changed the type of content to blogs. Now the data source is empty, but what the display data action does is actually pushes whatever's in this action, in our case, it's the result of step 1, into this data source here. So I know you can't see it, but that's what the display action does. And what you can then do is set the children elements or the children groups within the pop-up to equal parent groups blogs. So whatever blog is pushed into this pop-up will be accessible through all its child elements. Now we have that set up. What we're going to do is create a new page for our blogs to display. So we're going to call this page, and we're going to set it up as a default page for now. Actually, we'll base it off the index page, but we're going to remove a lot of these things. So I'm going to change the heading to the blog's title. So first up on our new page, you see an option to set the type of content of the page. Now, what does this mean? Here you can see all of the data types we've created in the app. And if I set type blog, what that means is that this page can access the blog, whatever blog is posted, similar to the display or post data into a pop-up. You can also post data to a page. And what that does is actually attaches a unique ID in the URL, which you can then use in any of your elements. If you see here, you can use the current page's blogs. So there's a lot of use cases for this, but particularly here, we're going to have different blogs, which are going to be attached as different unique IDs in the page URL. And we're going to want to access those in this dynamic blog page. And you'll understand more about that when we actually get the page working. But what I'm going to do here is set the heading to the blog's title. So current page's blog's title. And we're going to delete that for now. Now we don't need these fields, so I'm going to delete those. And for now, I will keep this, and I'm actually just going to post the text of the blog in this page. So we're going to grab our text element. We're going to delete that. And this text element is going to be, I'm going to add some padding here. Let's add 60 padding at the top and 60 at the bottom. And this text element is going to be our blog. So we're going to have current page blogs, blog content. So let's take a look at what this looks like. We need to go back to our index page and make sure when we click the next button, we are actually sending the data to that page. So we'll come here on the next button, we'll edit the workflows. So displaying our data in the pop-up and then on pop-up preview blogs. When they click yes, we want to send them to that blog page. Blog, and the data to send is that data that's going to be accessible via the URL, which is going to be the parent group's blog. So when they click that, they should be sent to the blog page where they can then pull the title and data. So let's give this a text run and see what happens. Again, we're going to do a blog on how the YouTube channel. It's going to be in the finance category or technology. Next. Cool. And then let's click next. We're going to get our OpenAI generation. Now we have our generation, which is cool. What I'm going to do is make some small modifications to this, and then I'm going to click next, and you'll see we get our blog preview. Now what I should do is probably include the text in here, which we'll edit later. But when I click yes, you'll see we get a page redirect, and we load into this new page. Now you can see that something hasn't worked here. Oh, so it took a bit of time to display, but you can now see we've got our text, our title, and our description. So what we're going to work on next is how we can format this a little bit nicer. We're also going to explore the URL and how we can clean up the UX of this entire flow. So now that we have this working, the next thing we're going to do is try and improve the UX and the formatting of this blog page a little bit better. And after that, we'll work on getting a scrollable section that shows other blog posts. In the future as well, with an application like this, you'd probably have some sort of header, potentially your website or something like that on this page above the title. A lot of people add, me and myself included, on our agency webpage, a lot of people add a blog section where you post these dynamic blogs. So the first thing we're going to do is in the pop-up, we're going to display the title here, your blog titles, and we're going to get the OpenAI title. All right, so that's our blog title there. So that smoothens things out a little bit. Let's give this another test. Awesome. Now, what we might do as well is with the next button, what we did was when we went to the new page, we saw that there was a small lag in the time it takes for Bubble to create the actual record and then for it to get displayed on the page. There's a few different ways we can go about reducing the user experience of this. So one way could be to show the loading pop-up again for 2 seconds and then direct them to the page. So the way I'm going to do that is instead of putting go to page blog there, what I'm going to do is hide an element, which is the pop-up preview blog. And I'm going to show an element pop-up loading. We're going to set the state of the pop-up. We're going to set the heading as redirecting to page, ... message. We are redirecting you to your new blog post. Now we're going to show that pop-up loading. We're going to copy this. And what we're also going to do is attach a state. So with the pop-up, actually what we can do here is we're going to schedule a custom action. So here when we go create a custom event, I'm going to call this redirect to blog page. And let's add a parameter and let's add the blog. So the blog is of type blog and it's not optional, it's required. And then what we can do is paste the go to page blog and use this repeating group's blog in the actual, when we redirect the page. So when button yes is clicked, we can delete this now. So we're going to delete that. We're going to show the pop-up loading and we want it to stay there for about 2 seconds. And then what we're going to do is schedule the custom event to trigger in 2 seconds, which is going to redirect them to that blog generation page. Now there's 2 options you have when you use custom events. One is schedule a custom event. And what this does is allows you to schedule it in a number of seconds. Or option 2 is trigger a custom event. Now there's a pretty strong differential between these 2 events. Trigger happens instantly. And what happens in Bubble's workflows is these work sequentially usually. So what that means is every step completes before the next step starts. But if we use something like the schedule event, that doesn't work sequentially. So if we included the schedule event here and we wanted whatever happens in this custom event to process before we move to step 5, you have to use the trigger event and not the schedule event, even if the scheduler's delay is 0 seconds. So that's the key difference between the 2. So what we're going to do is schedule the redirect in 2 seconds. And what that should allow us to do is add that extra 2 seconds of time, which should reduce the loading time on this page. So this is just a way you can kind of think about improving the user experience on your page for things like loading times. The other thing as well, I'm going to center align that text and center align, that text is actually from the rich text editor, but the title we can definitely center align. So I'll come here and we'll just change the alignment to be central. Now let's preview the index page in our new loading spinner. So this one's going to be a blog on how to grow your Twitter profile. And it's going to be in the finance. Next. Awesome. Should we show our loading pop-up? Cool. Now we have our blog here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bold this text. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger and I'm going to center align it. This one here. Cool. And I'm going to click next. Now you'll see what happens. We can see preview your blog titled. Yep, that's correct. We click yes. We get our redirecting to page pop up and then it redirects us to the page. So you can see that's one way of trying to improve the user experience and let your users know what's happening when certain delays are happening within the app. Because at least if you can give them a message explaining what's happening, they're not sat in the dark with a random loading spinner or a frozen page for multiple seconds. Those are the kind of things that cause your app users to close the page or leave your application. So you can see that we've got this new blog working, everything's formatting and looking nice. So what can we do to add to this? Now, if a user is to read your blog, once they get to the end, they're probably going to be interested in reading something else. So what I'm going to do is add a repeating group that stores all of our blogs and allows users to scroll through, press on a blog, and view that new blog. So what we're going to do here, and it's a really cool way of exploring what a repeating group is. So I'm going to come to the blog page, and what we're going to do is here, let's just check the hero to make sure. Cool, that's our background color. So what I'm going to do is on group C, going to add a new group. So we can just copy and paste this. Copy, paste, and I'm going to call this group carousel. Now, in this group, we're going to have our repeating group. And as you can see here, we have a range of different settings. So I'm going to delete the text. And you can see we have a data source. We also have numbers of rows and columns. So you could have a list that displays vertically or horizontally. In our case, we want it to display horizontally. So it's only ever going to have one row. And for now, let's set it up with 3 columns just during the setup. Now, what it's going to do is show the blogs. And what we probably wanted to do is filter by the date that the blog was created. We want to show our newest pieces first. You could also sort this by something like popularity if you had a data field for that, or any kind of alphabetic or numeric data type, field. And then what I'm going to do is obviously set this type to blogs. Now within here, we're going to post an image. So what we'll need to do is add an image on the blog post back on the blog page. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a group. I'm going to call it a column group, and I'm going to set the background as white just so we can see what it is. I'm going to set some padding so that there's some margins, so there's some spacing. I'm going to round the outsides just a touch, and I'm going to make it stretch to the height of the repeating group. Now within here, we're going to have 2 things. We're going to have the image. And that image we want to keep square. So I'm going to leave this 150. Actually, we want the width to stretch. And the height, I'm going to put the minimum height at 100 for now. And actually what I'll do, I'm probably just going to have this sit at 100. Let's see what that looks like. Let's take a look at 50. Fixed width. Do 150. And we'll have it sit centrally. We're also going to add some padding on the white background. Actually, we'll probably do 12, 12, 12, and 12. Nice square padding. And then what we're going to do is add the blog title just beneath that. So I'm going to put heading 6. We'll center it, and we'll do the current cell. So we need to set the state of the group to the current cell's blog. And then what we can do here is we haven't added an image field yet, but what we can do is get the current cell or parent group blogs title. And we're going to set some spacing between here, say 12. And I'm actually going to have that fit height to content. Now, in our blog data type, we're going to add a field called image, which is going to be an image type. And what we're going to do is refresh our page, and on our blog page, we're going to add a field to upload an image. I'm going to add it in the title section. So we'll come down here, go to step 2, And in here, I'm going to add an image. So let's put an image there. We'll replicate that. We'll go previous and we'll go attach an image to your blog post. Now how can we actually attach an image? So this is a cool way of, I'm going to arrange this in a column container. We're going to have two things in here. We're going to have a file uploader. So we'll come down to the file uploader, drag that into the group. And you can see here we get this nice little looking file uploader. For me, the typical file uploader has dashed lines around it, and I'm going to stretch it to be a minimum width. Yep, 200 sounds good. 200 to 400. And I'm going to set the min height to cool. So it's going to be a pretty big file uploader. And what I'm going to then do is set our image. I'm going to keep this fixed as well. Let's say for now, 200 to 400. All right, so the file uploader is treated like an input field. So what we can do when we're trying to set this up is we want them to upload the file and then to show the image when a file is uploaded. So what you can do is come down to this element action and you can view and play around with all these different actions. There's a lot of different ones to get your head around. I'd recommend seeing the reference on the Bubble manual to familiarize yourself with these. But what you're going to want to do is come down to the input field is changed and search for your file uploader. Now, when that file uploader is changed, what we want to do is make a change to the blog. But the good thing about this is we haven't created the blog at this stage. So what we want to do, instead of saving it to the blog, we're going to have a custom state on here. And we're going to call it blog image, which is an image type. So instead of making change to the blog, we're going to set the state of the hero's blog image to this file uploader's value. Now, that's going to allow us to upload an image. And what I'm going to do is say when hero's blog image is empty, this element is visible. So, is not empty. And likewise, we're going to copy that onto the file uploader, except when image is empty, that's when this is visible. When it's not visible, we want to collapse the element. So I'm going to collapse that element when it's not visible. And what we should also do is add a simple delete button. So I'm actually going to go one step further and add the delete button on top of the image. So here we're going to call this heroes image. And we're actually going to wrap this into we're going to copy this expression, remove that, make it visible again, and we're going to wrap it into an align to parent container, Now, why are we doing that? Because I want to display a delete icon on top of the image. So first up on group view, I'm going to paste that condition back. I'm going to have this collapsible unless it's visible. And then on the image, we're going to scroll down to the icons. And we're going to add a trash can. And we're going to make it red. Here we've got red. Now we want to align it to the top right. So I'm going to click this top right align to parent. Thing. So that's central. This is top right, but I want to give it a little bit of padding. So I'm going to give it 8 and 8. Cool. Now, when that button's pressed, usually you'd want to show some sort of pop-up. For this video, we're just going to add it. It's going to clear the custom state. So we're going to set the state with hero image into nothing again. So that's how we can potentially delete the image if necessary. So let's give that a go. And the last thing we're going to do is modify the next button in our group step 3. When it creates the blog, we want to save the image, which we haven't added yet. So image equals heroes blog image. Awesome. And on our blog page, what we will do is let's add our image before the title. So we're going to have
320 by 320 image. I'm going to put some padding at the top, and it's going to be current page blogs image. Awesome. So let's give this a test. So we're going to preview the page. We're going to say, cool. And we're going to attach an image. Now, I've been doing a fair bit of work with some things for Twitter, so I'm just going to add that image for now. Cool. So you can see we get our Twitter logo in here. That button probably needs a little bit more formatting. And this obviously isn't hiding, so that's something we're going to touch up quickly. But I'm going to run the next steps just to not slow us down here. In the meantime, I'll get that open, edit properties, group P, group step 2. So we have here this. So you can see here we've actually have to untick that. So we have to untick this when we get around to it. But we have our blog. I'm going to click next. I'm going to preview the page. And let's see if our image renders. Cool. Awesome. So we have the image loading. We also have our repeating group working, but we still need to add the images and touch this up a little bit more, which we'll do in the next video. So what I've done is I've come in here. We now have our page. I've come across to the index page where I touched up the file uploader bug, which was basically just unticking this element is visible on page load check. So we now have our blog showing. And what I also did is came down to the bottom here and just assigned the parent group's blog image with the actual blog here. Now, I don't really like this background. So with the repeating group, I'm going to remove that. And when we refresh the page, we should have 3 nice kind of bubbles here. Oh, it's still got the overall background. So border style, going to remove that as well. And you'll see we get 3 kind of nice options for our blog. Now, what we haven't set up is actually redirecting to that page when that specific column is pressed. So again, what we're going to do is go to page, blog, and we're going to send the current cells blog again. So what we should be able to see here is when we check this one here, click this page. So one way to debug this and see if it isn't working is hit this step by step. So the debugger is actually a really important tool. And there's a few things you can do in here. So one is you can run workflows step by step. Another thing you can do is search for specific elements within your app. And a reason for that is you might want to take a look at what data source is being passed into a certain element to have an understanding of what's happening. So for example, here I'm looking at group blogs, and you can see here the parent group's blog is empty. Now I'm not actually sure whereabouts that group is, but that's just one example. Now when I click here, what's happening is go to page blog, current cells blogs. And what it's actually doing is because it's the same page, it's not reloading the page per se because we're already on the page. So you'll see I click this, loads X, I click this one, and we load to this page here. If you wanted to refresh the page, because we're on the same page, you could use the refresh the page operator if you wanted to give the user some sort of feeling that the page is actually refreshing, but we're not going to include that. Now, that's our basic blog setup. And what you can do is, I hope this gives you the tools to then go and embed this into your application wherever you see fit.